My name is Gabriel Townsend, and at 36 years old, I stood in the middle of a crowded, illuminated ballroom, and watched my stepmother point her manicured finger across the room at me, instructing a security guard to throw me out. I didn't cause an embarrassing scene, nor did I shed a single tear in front of her wealthy audience. I simply picked up my coat, turned my back on their judgment, and walked calmly toward the grand entrance doors. But by the time the valet pulled my car around to the front driveway, the quiet, agreeable woman who always steps aside had officially ceased to exist. The luxury hotel they were all standing in, celebrating their grand corporate success, had never actually belonged to them for a single second, and they were about to discover that terrifying truth the hard way. That night marked the first time in 16 long years that I had set foot inside the historic building my late mother had built with her own blood, sweat, and visionary labor. It was also the night I permanently stopped pretending I didn't know precisely who I was and what belonged to me. I built my private, independent life 3 hours away from that harbor entirely on purpose. My law firm occupies the second floor of a charming, historic brick building in downtown Townsend Property Law, with my own name proudly etched on the glass door, paid for entirely by 16 years of my own relentless, independent labor. Not a single cent of my business, my education, or my home was ever borrowed from my family. I draft complex commercial leases, I execute high-value real estate closings, and I analyze intricate trust instruments the exact way other people read the morning news, line by line, searching with clinical precision for the hidden trapdoor. For 16 years, that complete distance was our unspoken, comfortable arrangement. I didn't call my father, and he certainly didn't call me. The absolute silence felt like a hard-won peace, and I allowed myself to foolishly believe that peace and total absence were the exact same thing. Then the formal invitation arrived in my mail, a heavy, cream-colored cardstock envelope featuring elegant gold lettering announcing the Harbour Crown's 40th anniversary gala, hosted formally by Richard and Vivian Hale. My father's name was printed first, his new wife's name was printed second, and my late mother's name was nowhere to be found on the paper at all. There was a single, handwritten line at the bottom in my father's familiar, shaky print, "We'd love for you to come, Gabby." It was a hollow peace offering, I suppose, the very first words he had addressed to me in 4 long years. I almost tossed the invitation into the recycling bin twice. What stopped me wasn't a lingering desire to see my father, nor was it a wish to reconcile with his family. It was the specific physical address embossed directly beneath the gold lettering, the Harbour Crown, the waterfront, the grand building my mother had transformed from a rotting, abandoned inn into the finest luxury hotel on the entire coast. I wasn't attending the gala for my father, nor was I attending for the champagne or the grand speeches. I was attending simply to stand inside a sacred room she had built with her own hands and remember that she had once existed. I promised myself I would stay for an hour. I didn't even survive 20 minutes. To understand the profound tragedy of that night, you have to understand what my mother accomplished, because nobody standing in that glittering ballroom wanted to remember her. Diane Townsend purchased the original Harbour Crown in 1985, when it was nothing more than a 40-room historical ruin featuring a collapsing roof, rotting floorboards, and a decaying wooden dock that no local boat captain trusted. The commercial banks literally laughed in her face when she applied for her first business loan. She mortgaged every asset she possessed twice over, painted the guest rooms herself, and learned how to repair the industrial basement boiler with her own hands. By the time I was old enough to walk down those wide, carpeted hallways, the hotel operated like a flawless Swiss watch. United States senators routinely booked the corner oceanfront suites, local couples planned lavish weddings 2 years in advance, and every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, the heavy bell on the old harbour buoy rang across the dark water, low, deep, and steady. Every single evening, my mother would stop whatever she was doing, look out the window, and listen to that bell. She placed a solid brass plaque directly beside the tall, arched window in the main lobby, the window that offered an unobstructed view straight out to the dock. She had it hand-engraved with a single line, "Built on the water, kept by the people who mean it." I used to stand beside her as a child, tracing those raised brass letters with my index finger while she worked. She fell mortally ill during the cold winter I turned 20 years old. It was pancreatic cancer, the ruthless, aggressive kind that refuses to negotiate with doctors. She ran the daily operations of the hotel from an armchair in her office until her body wouldn't allow her to sit up, and then she managed the payroll from a hospital bed until she could no longer hold a pen. She passed away in early March. I was a college sophomore, returning home numb for her funeral, wearing an ill-fitting black dress. My father held my hand tightly during the funeral service and assured me that we would figure out the hotel's future together as a family. But we never discussed the hotel again, not a single word. I naively assumed that the property had simply passed to him through standard marital inheritance laws, the way real estate automatically transitions to a surviving spouse. I was catastrophically wrong about that. I just wouldn't discover precisely how wrong I was for 16 more years. Vivian entered my father's life 3 years after the funeral. She was a polished, high-end hospitality consultant whom my father had originally hired to modernize the hotel's brand. She was 58 years old now, sharp, impeccably tailored, possessing a loud, socialite laugh that she could turn on and off like a faucet. Within a single year of her arrival, she was my stepmother. Within 2 years, she was effectively running every department of the hotel. I watched her systematic erasure of my mother's memory from a safe distance, the way a person watches a dark storm system move across a bay. First came the quiet destruction of her legacy. My mother had created the Diane Townsend Culinary Fund, a modest charitable trust that provided full scholarships for local underprivileged kids to attend culinary school. Vivian quietly rebranded it into something called the Hale Family Initiative, same money, but featuring her own family name prominently on the press releases. Next came the physical remodeling of the building. The historical brass plaque beside the lobby window was taken down under the guise of wall renovations and never reinstalled. Finally came the total destruction of the brand itself. The historical harbour crown officially became the flagship of the Hale collection, complete with a sleek new logo, luxury stationery, and a glossy marketing website, where the origin story of the hotel somehow miraculously began in the exact year my father remarried. And then there was Brooke, Vivian's 30-year-old daughter from her previous marriage, who was abruptly handed the executive title of creative director alongside a sprawling corner office on the top floor. Brooke had never poured a single cup of coffee for a guest in her entire life. Her primary contribution to the hotel was redesigning the silk dinner napkins. I attempted to speak up once, 4 years ago, during a tragic Thanksgiving dinner that I never should have agreed to attend. I asked gently, politely, why my mother's name had been completely removed from the historical wall display. Vivian set her wine glass down with a sharp clatter, and looked at me as if I were a common criminal who had just tracked mud across her pristine white carpets. Diane is gone, Gabriel. Her voice had been almost patronizingly kind. This is the Hale era now. We have to move forward. My father kept his eyes firmly glued to his dinner plate, saying nothing, while Brooke smirked silently into her napkin. I drove 3 hours back to my apartment that night and vowed never to return, until that gold-embossed invitation arrived, and I allowed myself to foolishly believe that a peace offering actually meant peace. The harbour crown still possessed the power to take my breath away as I pulled my car off the highway, gleaming brilliantly against the dark coastal water, 4 grand stories of white stone, warm yellow light, and historic archways. It looked precisely like the photograph my mother had kept on her bedside table until her final breath. I sat behind the wheel in the parking lot for a full minute, forcing my lungs to expand before I gathered the courage to step inside. The main lobby served as my very first emotional wound. Where my mother's hand-engraved brass plaque had hung by the tall oceanfront window for decades, there was now a cold, backlit panel made of polished chrome and frosted glass, the Hale Collection, established 2012, a historical lie printed in bold letters. The tall window still looked out toward the dark dock, but nobody standing in that room was looking out at the water anymore. I was standing near that window, my coat folded over my arm, when a deep, raspy voice called out my real name. "Good to see you back home, Miss Townsend." It was Sal. He had managed the front door since long before I was born, and he had to be at least 70 years old now, yet he still stood as straight as a soldier, taking his job with absolute, dignified seriousness. He took my coat from my hands the exact, respectful way he used to take my mother's coat decades ago. "Sal," my throat tightened with sudden emotion. "You're still working here?" He offered a sad, knowing smile. "Somebody has to stay and remember how this place was built, Miss Townsend." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a whisper. "They shoved all of your mother's personal office items up into the fourth-floor storage room years ago. Her brass plaque is up there, too. I couldn't stop them, but I made sure it was safely hidden." Before I could reply, a sudden shift in the room's energy occurred. Across the crowded ballroom, near a towering crystal champagne fountain, Vivian's head turned sharply. Her calculated eyes locked onto me through 40 feet of glittering chandeliers and high society chatter. Her social smile froze entirely. She set her champagne flute down on a waiter's tray and began walking purposefully across the floor toward me, flanked by 3 men wearing dark security suits. The ballroom was packed to capacity with influential guests, which was precisely why she had chosen that exact moment to act. Local real estate investors were gathered near the open bar. A senior reporter from the Regional Business Journal was circulating with a digital voice recorder, and 2 prominent members of the hotel's advisory board were standing near the grand staircase. My father was holding court near the speaker's podium, looking aged, tired, and laughing entirely too loudly at a joke Brooke had just made. Vivian reached me first. Up close, her polite social mask dropped completely, revealing pure hostility. "What on earth are you doing in this building, Gabriel?" she demanded coldly. "Dad personally sent me an invitation," I replied, keeping my voice impeccably level and calm. "I have the card with his handwriting right here in my purse." "There has been an unfortunate administrative mistake," she stated loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear every word. "This is a private, ticketed event reserved strictly for family members, board executives, and primary corporate partners." Heads were turning throughout the lobby now. The business reporter drifted closer to observe the confrontation. "I am family, Vivian," I said firmly. That was the exact moment she executed her move. She raised her manicured hand, offered a clear signal to the security guards standing behind her, and declared in a loud, commanding voice that echoed across the quieted circle, "Security, please escort this woman off the property immediately. She is not family." The entire room fell into an uncomfortable, absolute silence. I looked past her shoulder for my father. He had already rushed over, standing at my elbow, his face flushed with deep embarrassment, but his eyes held no anger toward his wife. They held only a pathetic, desperate plea toward me. "Gabby," he whispered in a hushed tone meant only for my ears. "Please, sweetheart, don't make a scene in front of everyone. Don't make a scene." 16 long years of standing aside, 16 years of watching them erase my mother's life, and that was the singular instruction he chose to give me. Not to his ruthless wife, but to his discarded daughter. Brooke appeared beside her mother, her smartphone partially raised, a smug, victorious smirk covering her face. A young security guard touched my elbow gently, looking deeply embarrassed. He didn't want to be enforcing her cruel order any more than I wanted to endure it. I looked at the cold chrome panel on the wall where my mother's plaque belonged, then looked through the tall window at the dark, churning water outside. I slowly reclaimed my coat from Sal's hands, turned my back on my family, and walked out into the cold night without uttering a single word. Behind me, I heard Vivian's bright, loud voice instantly resuming its social tone for the crowd. "So sorry about that, everyone. Some unfortunate people simply cannot let go of the past." The biting coastal wind blowing off the harbor hit my face like a physical slap, and I was intensely grateful for the cold. I handed my ticket to the valet and stood at the edge of the circular driveway, forcing my lungs to breathe deeply. Out past the dark wooden dock, hidden in the black water, the old boy bell suddenly rang out, 6 o'clock sharp. The exact same low, steady, resonant note my mother used to stop and listen to every evening of her life. It didn't sound like comfort to me that night. It sounded like a funeral bell tolling for a life that had been systematically stolen. She is not family, Vivian had declared with absolute authority. And the most agonizing realization, the realization that sat in my chest like an iron weight, was that for 16 years, I had quietly allowed her declaration to become a reality. I had allowed them to take down the brass plaque, I had allowed them to rename the culinary fund, and I had allowed my mother's entire life's work to be rebranded, one quiet surrender at a time. I had convinced myself that my complete silence was a form of noble dignity. It wasn't dignity, it was total surrender wrapped in a nice coat. Standing in that freezing driveway, watching my breath fog in the air, I didn't feel rage, or a desire for childish revenge. I felt something infinitely colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. I felt completely, totally awake. I possessed a heavy cedar box that I had never opened, a box containing my mother's most private personal belongings, sealed tightly since her funeral, sitting inside a commercial storage unit that I paid for every month, but had never possessed the courage to visit in 16 years. I had spent over a decade telling myself I wasn't emotionally ready to confront what lay inside it. But as the valet pulled my car around to the front curb, I realized that my time of not being ready was officially over. I tipped the young valet, climbed behind the wheel, and drove straight into the dark night, not toward my home 3 hours away, but directly toward the storage facility, operating with a cold, unwavering resolve to finally discover what my mother had left behind for me. Unit 114 smelled of stale dust, cold concrete, and decades of forgotten time. I hadn't stepped inside that metal door in 11 years, not since I had moved cities and crammed everything I couldn't bear to look at into a 5x10-foot box of corrugated steel. Most of the unit was filled with heavy furniture draped under faded white sheets, a rusted bicycle from my teenage years, and boxes of tax records that should have been shredded long ago. But in the back, sitting on a high wooden shelf that I had built with my own hands, sat the heavy cedar box. My mother had commissioned a local craftsman to build it the year before she got sick. It was crafted from tight-grained wood the exact color of wild honey, featuring a small brass latch, and her initials burned into the center of the lid. She kept her most vital personal records inside it. After her funeral, my father had handed it to me in the church parking lot, muttering that it was mine and just mine. I had never opened it. For 16 years, I had lacked the courage to lift that brass latch. I carried the box to the front of the unit, and set it down on an overturned wooden crate directly beneath the single bare light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The brass latch was stiff with age. My hands, which were normally so steady during complex contract negotiations, were trembling uncontrollably. I sat down on the freezing concrete floor, pulled the box into my lap, and wept for the first time in years. They were not the polite, quiet tears of a formal funeral, they were the raw, ugly, gut-wrenching tears that fall when a person finally stops holding a door shut against their own grief. I cried for my mother, for the frightened 20-year-old girl in the ill-fitting black dress, and for every 6 o'clock boy bell I had intentionally refused to hear for 16 years. When the wave of emotion finally passed, I wiped my face on my sleeve, placed my thumb on the brass latch, and paused. Some doors, as it turns out, require you to be invited through, even by the dead. Sitting on that storage room floor at midnight, I suddenly recalled her voice. It returned all at once, complete and clear. During the final winter of her life, when she was still strong enough to sit up, she had asked me to push her wheelchair to the main lobby window of the Harbour Crown. The dock outside was covered in thick ice, and the buoy bell was silent under the freezing wind. She had stared out at the dark water for a long time before she spoke. Do you know what I finally figured out about this place, Gabby? I was 20 years old, terrified of losing her, and desperately pretending I was strong. What, Mom? I had asked. She had taken my hand, her grip already so much frail than I remembered, and said, "The water doesn't belong to whoever is the loudest in the room, sweetheart. It belongs entirely to whoever stays." At the time, I assumed she was referring to the dedicated hotel staff, cell at the front door, or the head chef, who had worked beside her for 2 decades. I had completely failed to understand her meaning. I had filed it away as the rambling poetry of a dying woman. But sitting on that cold concrete floor at midnight, I finally comprehended that she was telling me something deeply specific, something she fully expected me to find when I was ready to look. My mother never wasted words, especially not when she was dying. Whoever stays. I hadn't stayed. I had run away. I had permitted the loudest woman in 3 counties to walk into my mother's life's work and claim it as her own. But the cedar box was still mine. I pushed the brass latch upward. It gave way with a sharp, metallic click. I lifted the heavy wooden lid, bracing my spirit for overwhelming heartbreak, expecting to find old family photographs, a lock of hair, or the sentimental remnants of a life cut short. That was not what lay on top. Tucked neatly into the interior lining of the lid, held securely by a thin elastic band that had gone brittle with age, was a single business card made of heavy cream stock with navy lettering. It had been deliberately placed so that the very first thing anyone opening the box would see was this card, rather than the photographs beneath it. It read, "Marion Webb, Independent Trustee, Coastal Fiduciary Partners." Direct beneath the printed text, written in my mother's distinct blue ink, were 3 simple words, "Call her first." My heart hammered against my ribs. My mother had retained an independent corporate trustee. In my line of work, that meant one undeniable thing. There was an active trust, not a simple will or a probate estate that my father could easily manipulate, but an independent legal trust with its own fiduciary, completely separate from him. I was a professional real estate lawyer sitting on a concrete floor at midnight, and my entire professional brain went instantly quiet, hyper-focused, and laser-alert. The card featured a direct emergency phone line. I told myself it was midnight, that no corporate fiduciary answers their phone at such an hour, and that I should wait until normal business hours. I dialed the number anyway. I couldn't refrain from doing it. The phone rang twice. A calm, mature woman's voice answered, entirely awake and completely unperturbed, as though she had been patiently waiting for the call for a decade. "This is Marion Webb." "My name is Gabriel Townsend," I said, my voice coming out remarkably steady. "I think you knew my mother, Diane Townsend." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line, followed by a response that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Miss Townsend," the woman said softly, her tone rich with profound relief. "I have been patiently waiting 16 long years for this phone call." We met the following morning at 8 o'clock in a pristine office that smelled of aged leather, legal paper, and fresh coffee. Marion Webb was 60 years old, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, and possessed a quiet, precise manner of folding her hands that immediately communicated immense professional competence. On the mahogany table between us sat a single, thick manila folder with my mother's name typed on the side tab, Diane M. Townsend Family Trust. "Your mother formally engaged my firm in 2007, Marion explained gently, setting her glasses on the table. "Exactly 2 years before she passed away. She was extraordinarily organized about her estate planning. People who build empires from absolute nothing usually are." "Why did you wait 16 years to contact me?" I asked directly, leaning forward in my chair. "You knew where I lived. You knew I was an attorney." Marion opened the folder, but kept her hand resting flat on the first page. "Because the trust instrument contains very strict, mandatory provisions, Gabriel. Your mother explicitly instructed me in writing that I was never to seek you out, that I was required to wait until you came to find the box on your own terms. Furthermore, there was a specific age condition hard-coded into the execution clause. You had to reach 36 years of age. I froze. I had turned 36 just 2 months prior. Then the condition has been met, Marion continued quietly. Your mother believed with absolute certainty that if I approached you when you were too young, or emotionally fragile, your father and his associates would find a way to manipulate you or make the situation entirely about money. She used a specific phrase during our final meeting. She told me she didn't want to hand her daughter a weapon before she was strong enough to carry it. She wanted to hand her a choice when she was ready to stand on her own feet. I sat in absolute silence as her words washed over me. 16 years of believing that the Harbour Crown had simply passed to my father through default marital inheritance. 16 years of quietly allowing them to strip her name off the culinary fund, pull her brass plaque off the lobby wall, and rebrand her hotel, simply because I naively believed there was nothing left of hers to fight for. Mrs. Webb, I said, my voice dropping an octave, what precisely is held inside that trust? Marion turned the first legal page over. Almost every single physical asset that your father and stepmother currently claim to own, she stated plainly. She laid out the legal structure with surgical precision, watching my face carefully. The irrevocable trust owned a private holding company, a quiet, single-purpose corporate entity designed to hold title to real estate. Which specific property does the holding company own? I asked, though my legal mind already knew the terrifying answer. The land, Marion revealed smoothly. The entire waterfront parcel, the dock, and the 4-story stone building standing upon it. The Harbour Crown itself. I had spent 14 years writing those exact corporate structures for my own commercial real estate clients. In the legal profession, it is known as an OpCo-PropCo split. A brilliant strategy, where the real estate assets the PropCo are held safely inside a bulletproof trust, while the operational hotel business the OpCo merely leases the physical building from the property owner. Wealthy families utilize it to ensure absolute asset protection across generations. My mother had secretly constructed the PropCo, my father's business was merely the OpCo. The Hale collection does not own the hotel. I whispered, the sheer magnitude of the truth hitting me. They merely rent it. They lease it, Marion corrected cleanly. From an irrevocable trust that your father has served as an interim, highly restricted co-trustee of since your mother's passing. He has never owned the physical building, Gabriel. Nor has his new wife, or her daughter. They are commercial tenants. Marion turned to the next page in the folder. And there is one additional primary asset held inside the trust reserve. She named a figure that forced me to set my coffee cup down immediately. $17 million in liquid capital, held in conservative reserve funds, untouched and quietly growing for 16 years. My mother had set that vast fortune aside so that whoever eventually inherited the Harbour Crown would never be forced to mortgage the property, or bow to commercial banks the way she had been forced to do in 1985. However, it was not the $17 million that shattered my heart. It was the personal letter attached to the back of the file. Marion slid the sealed envelope across the desk toward me. It bore my name on the front in my mother's dark blue ink. I opened it with trembling fingers and read her words. Gabby, my sweet girl, if you are reading this letter, it means you finally found the cedar box, you met Marion, and you finally allowed yourself to look at the truth. I know how many years it took you to get to this moment. I know you, sweetheart, better than you know yourself. I did not build this entire structure simply so you would be wealthy. I built it so that no human being on this earth could ever make you feel small or helpless again. A building held in your absolute legal name is a home that no one can ever throw you out of. Your father is a good man at heart, but he is inherently weak. After I am gone, he will crave emotional comfort, and social standing far more than he craves what is right. Someone will eventually offer him that comfort at your expense. Do not hate him for his weakness, Gabby. Just make sure you never, ever pay for it. And then came the final, defining sentence that would guide my actions for the rest of my life: don't fight them with noise, sweetheart. Just stop renting them your silence. I read that sentence 3 times. I folded the paper carefully along its original crease and placed it inside my jacket pocket, directly over my heart. The water doesn't belong to whoever is the loudest. It belongs to whoever stays. She hadn't been talking about the door captain or the executive chef, she had been talking directly to me. Marion spent the next 2 hours walking me through every line of the trust agreement. My mother had established a long-term, commercial lease between the trust and my father's operating company. The lease required the operating company to pay monthly rent directly into the trust account, which explained why my father had never questioned the arrangement. He simply assumed the trust was a routine tax minimization vehicle managed by Marion's firm. But under the mandatory terms of the trust, my father's role as interim co-trustee was strictly limited. He could manage day-to-day hotel operations, but he had zero legal power to sell the real estate, encumber the land with mortgages, alter the trust provisions, or remove the independent corporate trustee. And most importantly, the trust agreement explicitly designated me as the sole successor trustee, with absolute, unilateral legal powers vesting automatically on my 36th birthday. As of 2 months ago, I held the absolute, exclusive legal authority to assume full control of the trust, terminate my father's interim role, manage the $17 million reserve, and enforce every single covenant of the commercial lease. Furthermore, my mother had inserted a specific, brilliant legal trapdoor directly into the commercial lease itself. The lease explicitly mandated that the operating company was legally required to preserve and maintain the historical Harbour Crown name, maintain the founder's commemorative brass plaque in the main lobby, and continue full funding for the Diane Townsend Culinary Fund as permanent, non-negotiable operational conditions of occupying the building. Any corporate rebranding or removal of the founder's historical markers required the express, written consent of the property owner, the trust. Vivian Hale had never requested consent from the trust to rebrand the hotel into the Hale Collection, nor had she requested permission to take down my mother's brass plaque or rebrand her charitable fund. She had simply assumed my father owned the building outright, and that no one would ever challenge her authority. In the dry, absolute language of contract law, Vivian had committed multiple material breaches of a commercial lease on a multi-million-dollar property. Diane is gone, Vivian had sneered at me 4 years ago during Thanksgiving dinner. This is the Hale era now. It turned out my mother had reached out from beyond the grave and drafted the exact legal clauses that rendered the Hale era entirely illegal. Then Marion dropped a critical, time-sensitive piece of intelligence onto the table. There is a severe timing factor you must be made aware of, Gabriel, she said grimly. Our firm just received the quarterly financial disclosures from your father's operating company. The Hale Collection is currently in the final stages of underwriting a massive $40 million commercial expansion loan with a major regional bank, set to close in less than 3 weeks. They intend to use the funds to purchase a second resort property further up the coast. Marion looked me straight in the eyes. And the primary collateral listed on their loan application, the primary asset securing that $40 million debt, is the physical land and building of the Harbour Crown. Their corporate attorneys have falsely represented to the bank's underwriting department that the operating company owns the real estate outright. My eyes narrowed into slits. The grand anniversary gala, the champagne fountain, the invited investors, the reporter from the Business Journal, it hadn't been an act of harmless social vanity. It was a massive corporate sales pitch designed to project an illusion of absolute wealth, while they attempted to fraudulently pledge my mother's property to a commercial bank to finance their expansion. They are attempting to mortgage my mother's building to a bank, I stated, my voice dangerously calm. Because they operate under the delusion that they own it, Marion affirmed. If that loan closes and defaults down the road, untangling the legal title through the courts will take years of agonizing litigation. But if you formally assume your role as sole successor trustee today and issue an official notice of default under the lease, the bank's legal department will immediately freeze the loan. I had exactly 3 weeks to stop renting them my silence. I did not execute my plan with screaming matches or dramatic public confrontations. I am a corporate real estate attorney. I execute my work through bulletproof paperwork. Over the next 4 days, Marion and I meticulously prepared the complete legal filing packet, a formal acceptance of successor trusteeship, an official notice of termination of interim co-trustee status directed to my father, a certified statement of trust ownership for the county land registry, and an official notice of commercial lease default directed to the operating company detailing their unauthorized rebranding, the removal of the founder's plaque, and the fraudulent representation of property ownership to commercial lenders. Before we formally served the papers. However, a sudden, aggressive move came from their side. On Thursday afternoon, a high-powered corporate courier arrived at my law office, handing me a thick, formal envelope from a major litigation firm representing the Hale collection. Inside was an aggressive cease and desist demand letter signed by their general counsel, Gregory Pace. It appeared someone at the bank's title department had raised a routine question regarding property title, prompting my stepmother's lawyers to panic. The letter aggressively accused me of unlawfully interfering with a legitimate family business enterprise and demanded that I immediately cease making inquiries regarding the hotel's corporate structure. Attached to the letter was a document titled First Amendment to the Diane M. Townsend Family Trust, dated 11 years ago, bearing my father's signature, which purported to strip me of my successor trustee status and grant my father total, unrestricted ownership powers over the trust assets. I sat at my desk and read the alleged amendment with clinical precision. It took me precisely 90 seconds to identify 3 catastrophic legal flaws that rendered the document a laughably obvious forgery. First, my mother's trust had become legally irrevocable the exact day she died in 2009. No living human being, not my father, not Gregory Pace, and not a judge, could legally amend an irrevocable trust 11 years after the settler's death. Second, even if the trust had permitted amendments during my father's lifetime, the terms explicitly required the written joinder and consent of the independent corporate trustee, Marion's firm, a signature that was entirely absent from the page. Third, and most embarrassingly, the forged amendment repeatedly referred to the Diane Townsend Foundation. My mother had never utilized the word foundation. She had named her entity the Diane Townsend Fund. Whoever had drafted the fraudulent amendment 11 years ago had casually copied the name off Vivian's recent corporate marketing brochures without ever reviewing the original 2007 trust documents. They had delivered a blatant, amateurish forgery directly to a forensic real estate lawyer and called it legal leverage. I immediately executed the formal acceptance of successor trusteeship, assuming absolute, sole control over the trust, the land, the building, and the $17 million reserve fund. I then instructed Marion's firm to simultaneously serve the formal legal packet to 3 specific destinations, directly to my father, directly to the underwriting legal counsel at the commercial bank, and directly to the board of directors of the operating company. The legal bomb exploded quietly at 11:42 a.m. on Friday. My phone began vibrating continuously on my desk. I did not pick it up. I let it vibrate. I walked out of my office, enjoyed a quiet lunch at a local cafe, walked through the park, and returned 2 hours later. When I finally turned my phone over, the screen displayed 68 missed calls, 24 from my father, 31 from Vivian, 8 from her daughter Brooke, and 5 from their terrified corporate attorney, Gregory Pace. The bank's underwriting department, upon receiving a certified notice of trust ownership and lease default from the actual legal owner of the land, had instantly cancelled the $40 million expansion loan, freezing all corporate credit lines pending a full fraud investigation. At 12:10 a.m. that night, loud, frantic knocking echoed against the front door of my residential apartment. I looked through the peephole and saw all three of them standing in the dimly lit hallway, Vivian draped in a coat she had thrown over her clothes, my father looking pale and trembling, and Brooke frantically holding her smartphone. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. "You have no legal right to do this to us, Gabriel," Vivian shrieked, shoving her way into my foyer, her social mask completely shattered into pure, unbridled rage. "You cannot crawl out of the shadows after 16 years and destroy everything we have built. The bank just cancelled our expansion loan. They have frozen our corporate operational accounts." "I haven't destroyed anything, Vivian," I replied, my voice completely level, calm, and icy. "I simply assumed my legal position as sole successor trustee of my mother's property. You are standing in my apartment, yelling at the absolute legal owner of the Harbour Crown." My father stepped forward, his hands shaking violently, his voice broken. "Gabby. Please, sweetheart, the board of directors is threatening to remove me as chief executive. The bank is threatening a corporate fraud investigation. They are saying we don't own the building. Tell me this isn't true." "You never owned the building, Dad," I stated plainly, looking him straight in the eyes. "Mom owned the land and the building. She placed it into an irrevocable trust before she died. You were merely an interim co-trustee of an operating company that leased the bricks from her trust. You knew this 11 years ago, when you signed that fraudulent, forged amendment that your wife's lawyers drafted." My father collapsed into a chair in my living room, covering his face with his hands, weeping silently as the full reality of his 16 years of cowardice crushed him. Vivian attempted one final, desperate play, stepping close to me, her eyes flashing with venom. "Fine. You own the physical bricks, congratulations. But the business belongs to us. The brand, the high society clients, the bookings, the Hale collection is worth nothing without our operational company. You will execute a new commercial lease with us on reasonable terms, or we will walk away and leave you with an empty, useless building." I offered her a cold, serene smile, pulled a document from my briefcase, and set it on the counter. "There will be no new lease negotiations, Vivian. I officially served your operating company with a formal notice of lease default this morning for material breach of contract, for illegally removing my mother's name, destroying her charitable fund, removing her historical brass plaque, and attempting to fraudulently mortgage her property to a bank. You have 30 days to surrender the keys and vacate my building." Vivian stared at me in total, paralyzed horror, realizing in one terrifying moment that her 16-year reign was officially over. She had called a security guard to throw me out of a ballroom, only to discover that I was the landlord who owned the floor she was standing on. The final resolution unfolded with absolute, clinical precision over the following month. Unable to secure commercial credit and facing immediate eviction for lease default, Vivian and her daughter were forced to surrender their operational control, stepping down from the hotel management entirely in total public disgrace. The Regional Business Journal published a scathing front-page investigation exposing the corporate misrepresentations of the Hale collection, permanently ruining Vivian's standing in New England hospitality circles. I established a new, professional management entity beneath the trust, hiring experienced, honorable hotel executives to run the daily operations, while fully reinstating the historical Harbour Crown name across all platforms. My father, broken and deeply repentant, was permitted to retain a modest, non-voting advisory role within the new organization, a mercy I extended solely because my mother's letter had asked me not to harbor hatred toward his weakness. 2 weeks later, I stood in the grand, sunlit lobby of the Harbour Crown alongside Old Sal. The cold chrome Hale collection panel was gone forever. Installed in its original, rightful place beside the tall oceanfront window was my mother's original brass plaque, restored, polished, and gleaming brilliantly in the sunlight, built on the water, kept by the people who mean it. At precisely 6 o'clock that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the deep, resonant ring of the Harbour Buoy bell echoed across the dark water. I stood by the window, placed my fingers against the raised brass letters of my mother's name, and listened to the sound of a home that was finally, permanently whole. I had spent 16 long years believing that silence was the only way to keep the peace, only to discover that the ultimate peace is found when you finally summon the courage to stand up, claim your rightful inheritance, and speak the absolute truth.